welcome to the Philly Factor. I'm your host, Paul Perrello. Have you ever had the feeling that sometime you just wanted to get away from it all? You wanted to unplug, you wanted to go off the grid, you wanted to get away from everything, but sometimes it's not all that realistic. However, my guest on this edition of the program did exactly just that. Margie Smith Holt was a honored professional in the world of the media here in Philadelphia, working for both print and television. Margie, perhaps, I'll ask her, had her fill of life here in the Philadelphia area and decided to literally pick up roots and relocate. And so, Margie, what a pleasure it is to see you again and talk about this great book that you have written. And we'll mention the name of the book as we go along. But was it really that like so many times, especially people in the media, get to that breaking point? They've just had it. They just want to get away from it all. They want to unplug. So what prompted you to pick up and move to some tropical island like 20 years ago?
Well, first of all, thank you for that great introduction. It's nice to be called an honored member of the Philly media because
you are.
A great first part of my career. I loved working in the media in Philadelphia, and I'd actually left journalism before I did my move to the islands. I kind of got to the breaking point with that, I guess. And after 14 or so years of doing the news, I switched into public relations, and I was at the Kimmel Center for the Performing Arts when it opened, which was kind of an exciting land on the so-called dark side to be in PR. And it was while I was there, coming up on the eve of my 40th birthday, I had my expectations for where I would be at that point in my life. Of course, I would be married and I would have kids, and in addition to this sort of exciting, glamorous career. And I was looking at 40 and didn't have those things and thought, well, what am I doing with my life? And also I had a big heartache at that time. So there was a breakup, and the guy I thought I was going to marry didn't work out. And it's like, okay, well, my instinct would have been to throw myself back into work. And I had a colleague who thought that was the dumbest idea she ever heard of. Said, you don't need more work, you need a vacation. Right. And he's the one actually who found St. John in the U.S. Virgin Islands, a place I had never heard of. We were both scuba divers. We went down for a scuba vacation and just kind of fell in love with the place down there and started talking to people about how they all got down there. And by the end of the week, I started to think, maybe this would be something interesting to try, and kind of went back to work and thought, well, no, that's not very practical, but the bug was there. And, a few months later, I was quitting my job and selling my car and putting my stuff in storage and going down to stay.
Yeah, it's funny in hearing your description, you are one of two people that I know that have gone this route. Another friend of mine working in radio just one day decided that's it. He had it. He just packed it all in. He was living in Orlando, and he traveled the world for a year, and he would just blog about all the places that he went. And I so admired the ambition and the guts, just like in your case, to sort of say, enough already. I'm looking for something different. Maybe it's that year 40 or it's 50 or even 60 that sort of stares you in the face, and you're like, what am I doing here? I got to do something, and I want to break out of this mold that I've been sort of pigeonholed into. So the fact that you did this, were there many people native to St. John's, or were there people like you who, from whatever walk of life they were in, just decided to relocate into the tropic islands?
I think it's a mixture. I mean, so obviously you have your ancestral native Virgin Islanders. So those are the people who live there. And then there's, even though it's a U.S. territory, there's a sort of expat community of an expat feel anyway. They're still Americans, of people who kind of moved down looking for something different. But when I went, I would say they mostly fell into two categories. You had the older folks, either the sort of kind of former hippies, sort of an older generation than mine, or the retirees who had had their life and had made their money and were down there. And you had the sort of 20-somethings who were trying to figure themselves out, taking a break before school or that kind of thing. There weren't a whole lot of people, I would say, in my age group, that kind of midlife 40, although there were some. And yeah, so, and it was not something that I ever thought that I would do. I was the practical worker, right? I was the good girl from Philadelphia, the practical hard worker, good student, kind of followed the path, and then got to this point and thought, well, I'm not getting what I want. So now, so now what? And I think it was almost someone asked me recently, did you have any regrets about doing this? I said, no, it was actually the idea of regret was kind of what prompted me from the other direction. It's like, okay, well, I am 40. I don't have any big responsibilities right now. Okay, I don't have kids. I don't have aging parents yet. I don't have any of those things. What if I don't do this now? I might regret it later that I didn't take the chance when I had this chance in front of me to say, just take a leap, see what happens.
How welcoming were the people of St. John's to this otherwise outsider that's coming from the mainland and relocating to St. John's? I mean, were they welcoming? Did they take a little bit extra time to warm up to you? Were they skeptical of you? Look, big city girl moving to the islands. What's the deal here?
There was definitely some of that. Overall, yes, it's an accepting community, but I was living in a little community called Coral Bay. I say a community because it doesn't even rise to the level of town. It was just sort of this outpost on the far side of the island, the other side, as people there would say. And there was this sort of big community of sailors and sort of kind of, these sort of reticent mariners and sort of tough island women. And yeah, I moved down with a friend who was another city girl, and here we are. And I'm sure they were sizing us up like, are these two, look at these two, are these two going to make it?
Right.
So there was definitely a hazing period where, people were always helpful, but they were a little standoffish. I like to tell the story, I went down there saying, I'm not going to do anything like I used to do. I'm not going to do any reporting. I don't want to write. I need to do something totally different. I'm going to get a waitressing job. And of course, my second week there, I met the editor of the local newspaper who cajoled me and followed me around till I agreed to do some writing. So I did start writing for the local paper. And the first story I did was a Thanksgiving story. So it was this community event. They called it Thankspigging. They roasted a giant pig. Everybody came together, and it's what we would have called in the old news days, like it was like a good news story, a happy news story. Of course, people will want to talk about this. And nobody would tell me their name. So I'm walking around this Thanksgiving event with my little notebook and my little camera, and people didn't want their pictures taken. They didn't want to talk to me, or maybe they would say something, but it was off the record and don't use my name. So that was that's kind of how it was in the beginning. So by the end of this whole adventure, when they're pouring their hearts out, telling me the hurricane stories 20 years later, I think it was a hard-earned position to be in because it took a while to warm up for sure.
Yeah, and that had to be kind of frustrating being a journalist when a source doesn't want to go on record, or they don't want to give you their name, or they'll talk to you, but that's a major hurdle on a good story, let alone something like this. Here I am doing a story, and no one wants to tell me who they are or what their name is.
Right, and the quotes were, "The turkey was good." I mean, it wasn't like there was anything controversial here, but I was like, okay, we're not in Kansas anymore. Like, this is a very different environment to be in. Yeah.
So all of these experiences lead you to writing a book. Was that I suspect it was not your intent when you first picked up and went to St. John's that you were there to write a book. So what causes you to, again, put pen to paper and decide that you're going to write this book?
So you're right. I didn't have any plan. I wasn't going down there to write the great American novel or anything. In fact, and this kind of dates my age, but when I was going down, one of my younger colleagues said, "Oh, you should start a blog and write about all of this." And I was like, "What's a blog?" Like, I don't know what a blog is, and it sounds like work. So I'm not going to do that. But I did have an email list. I did have, my list of people who knew I was going off and doing this and wanted to know what was happening. So I was writing stories home in the form of email just to tell people what was going on. So So I get asked a lot, how did you remember all that detail? Well, I wrote it down. I wouldn't have remembered any of this detail if I hadn't written it down. And the place was just so rich. I mean, it's this beautiful island to begin with, and the characters were so colorful and the stories were so funny. And adapting to all of that was sort of a humorous tale. So I had done those stories, and a few of my journalist friends from back in Philly were saying, hold on to these because you might want to put them into a book someday. So that was very flattering, especially coming from television and radio. So I remember one of my colleagues from the Daily News responding to one of my emails and saying, oh my God, this whole career in TV, I had no idea you could write like this. What are you doing in television? I was like, yeah, well, we think we're pretty good in TV too, but all right, whatever. And I actually never really thought of myself as a writer until I stopped writing for a living. And then there I was waitressing during the day and going home at night with my little laptop and pounding out these stories on just what I had seen all day. And it was a very creative period of my life. So I did keep the stories. Like I said, kind of tucked them away, thinking, well, maybe one day I'll put it all together into a book.
I want to mention Margie's website, where we can find out more. You can find out more information about Margie and other things that she's involved in, which hopefully if we have time at the end of the show, we'll get to, but also have information about her book. It's margiesmithholt.com. You can find more information out about her book. And I guess this would be a good time to mention the title of the book. It's a mouthful, I'll tell you that, but it sort of summarizes what there it is. Not on any map. And how this, I guess, being here in Philadelphia, it's funny that the newspaper people remark that you could write, because so often in radio and television, we sort of like, well, what do they know? They're just radio and television people,
exactly.
Right? Yeah, exactly. It's like, you could write? Yeah, it's a whole other topic for a whole other day. But you find yourself then, and here in Philadelphia, you've lived through hurricanes. We all have, but now you're out on a venture, not at St. John's, but you find yourself then back in the field as a reporter, covering not one but two hurricanes that hit the island.
Yeah, so that right. I've covered I've countless storms and weather events as a reporter in Philadelphia, but for most of those, you go in when it's happening, right? It's coming, the storm's coming. You're reporting on that. You're there for the storm. You're in TV. You're out there in the storm, telling people to stay inside. That whole ridiculous thing. And then you're there the day or two after to see what happens, and then that's it. And then you move on to the next thing. I ended up reporting on what happened down there because I wasn't a reporter at that point. I was back. I had finished my journey. I had lived in the islands for a couple of years. I had done this incredible sail across the Atlantic in this little boat. I ended up back in Philadelphia, and I was actually at the Jersey Shore on September 6th, 2017, when these storms were hitting down there. And I'm watching TV in the Weather Channel, and the meteorologists are all talking about this massive monster storm, like the likes of which the Caribbean has never seen, was about to hit the United States, because it was on a course to hit South Florida, which of course is very populated. Well, meanwhile, I'm looking at the television, and here's this gigantic swirl of angry red covering the U.S. Virgin Islands and the surrounding islands. So while everyone up here is saying, oh, it's about to hit the U.S., it's like, no, it's hitting the U.S. right now. It's on top of the U.S. Virgin Islands. No one's even talking about it. And then when it was over, it was 2 days before there was any news at all from anyone down there. So we didn't know what happened. So anyone who was on the mainland wondering what happened to friends and family and the island just had to sit and wait, because there was no news. And then over the next couple of weeks, little bits of information would trickle out, but still, as the disaster, because it was such a large disaster in so many areas, and the news, the networks and all did start covering the storm in a broader sense, but there still was not a lot of mention of the Virgin Islands. And I wrote an op-ed actually in the Philadelphia Inquirer saying, don't forget this little this little place that's also part of this country. And these are Americans who are also in need and suffering right now. And an old boss of mine from my TV days got in touch and said, well, you need to cover this story. Like, this is your story. And I said, well, I don't have a platform. I don't have, I'm not working for the news anymore. I'd stopped freelancing because was getting harder and harder. Everyone was cutting back in the media. And he basically said, that's beside the point, right? It's a story. It's the biggest story you'll ever have. And you're a journalist. And so I think that was the motivation to go back at that point as many times as I could. And I went back maybe half a dozen times over the course of a year to really sink into some reporting on how does a place, first of all, what happened, because we still didn't know what happened, and then how does a place recover from something that catastrophic?
Many of the people that you made friends with while you were there were still on the island, I assume, and I'm sure they were happy to see you. But we had seen, I guess, the horror of what played out in Puerto Rico with one of the hurricanes. But how were these people when you went back? How receptive were they to you that you were back there, and how were they dealing with the aftermath of these storms?
I think there was so much shock in the beginning. That's sort of the first thing. I didn't want to go if I was going to be a burden, because where would I even where will I even stay? Am I going to take resources away? So I think it was maybe 6 weeks by the time I finally got down there. And the people that I knew, I think, were mostly glad to see me, to the extent that they could be glad about anything. It was just, they were just sort of living in this day-to-day crazy environment. And people were kind of standoffish, like they didn't want to talk about things. They were just sort of dealing with what was in front of them. But I think that just being there, the more time that I was around, the story started to spill out. Or, there's one thing I say in the book where there was the mantra for a while. It's like, how are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. We're fine. Everybody's fine. Yeah, I'm doing okay. We're fine. And then 3 hours later, you'd still be sitting there. I wouldn't have to ask a question. Like, people would sit down and start to talk about what had happened. And some of the stories, it took maybe a year for them to even come out. Like, people just didn't want to sit down and talk about it. And then when they finally did, they would say that, that's the first time I ever talked about it, having lived through this horrible thing that happened a year before. And you're right, Puerto Rico. So that was the same. That was Maria that hit Puerto Rico. That was the second storm on St. John. And it was a massive humanitarian crisis there because of the population, because it's so big. St. John is very small. But I think what I was able to do in telling the story, it's a universal story. It's the same story. So in the book, as a reader, you've gotten to know this place and these characters because it's such a small place. So, and it was also ground zero for this particular storm, for Irma. So, when you talk about what they went through, you can kind of see that's what's happening on a larger scale in other places.
Yeah. This whole experience then, as I would suspect, if anybody, invested so much time and effort on the island as a resident, and then to go back as not only a resident but a reporter, how did this shape you, or how did this define you post media career? Because you go back and you see the devastation just on one level. That's got to have such an impact on you personally that it leaves an indelible mark on you.
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is telling the story that wasn't mine, right? So I had all these stories that were my stories, and some of them are fun and interesting and entertaining and adventurous. And that's kind of a fun tale to tell of this experience that I had. But then to tell the story of what happened to the place and the people is, I think that's just such an innate part of who I am and what my career has been, right? So this whole thing starts off as I'm trying to get away from this old career and make this new life and find out other things about myself and challenge myself. And then ultimately it comes full circle, and it come back and say, well, this may be the biggest piece of reporting I've ever done, is to tell this story about what happened somewhere else and what is happening on the planet with climate change.
Yeah.
through the eyes of these very specific people.
Yeah.
Means so much to me. I mean, this book started out as a love letter, to this place that changed my life, and I pretty much finished with one draft of the book right before the hurricanes hit, and then the whole story changes, and you wonder, like, well, does this paradise even exist anymore?
Yeah. Yeah. You're now back on the mainland of the United States. I believe
Yeah.
you're living in New York, and you're involved in in a few other projects. And what strikes me is that the old saying, you could take the kid out of Philly, but you can't take the Philly out of the kid. So in your case, Margie, it's like, well, you could take Margie out of the business, but she's still in the business because of your work now with storytelling and helping people tell their stories and write their stories.
Yeah, I mean, I like to say too, I think I got my Philly up a little bit with the whole publication of the book, because after I finished telling this whole story and was not having a whole lot of luck finding someone who was interested in publishing these stories, first as they were coming out little by little after the hurricanes. And that's when I was like, well, okay, I guess it's going to be a book then, because it's not running in the newspaper anywhere. And then with the publishing, I published on my own. It's like, oh yeah, you think people don't want to read this story? Well, I disagree. And we'll find out who wants to read this story, because these are important stories to tell. Yeah, I'm half-time in New York and half-time in Ocean City, New Jersey still. So I'm still very local. I had a cancer diagnosis, which is what brought me back to the mainland originally. I'm fine now, but I since then got involved with a writing program at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, a program called Visible Ink, which is a writing mentoring program for cancer patients, for them to tell their stories. And that's been amazingly rewarding. And it's just, it's like teaching. So I had a little stint teaching at Temple. I mean, it's just whether you're teaching future journalists or just anyone who wants to tell their story. And now it's so much easier for anybody, right? Not only to write their story, but to get it out there in some kind of way.
Yeah. Have you been back, or will you go back to St. John's at any point?
Oh yeah, I go back. I honeymooned there. I did finally get married. I met another guy.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We honeymooned there, which I say was maybe not the best place to honeymoon if you wanted some privacy, because I knew so many people there. And I generally get back every year, usually for an extended stay, to house sit or visit friends. After the hurricanes, they were sort of just getting back on their feet when COVID hit. So there was a couple of years there where I didn't get back, although they did gangbusters, because it was one of the few places you could travel, and a lot of people did. And I was just there a couple of weeks ago for my first time back since the book came out. So that was very rewarding, because I figured, well, this will be the time. If anyone has any complaints, I'll hear them. And I didn't hear any complaints. So I think I did okay.
Yeah, no, you did okay. You did better than okay, for sure, from everything that I've read about the book and the reaction to the book. We just have a few minutes left, and part of me is like, being a news hound like I am, just like you were. Do you miss the business? I mean, it's hard to say, because the business has changed. I mean, the business changes every day, but given everything that you put into it and where the business is going and where we see it going, I mean, do you, the classic, oh, I don't miss the business, I miss the people. So
that's exactly what I was going to say, which I guess that's cliche, but it's so true. And I came back into the business, I don't know, well, that's 10 years ago now, on a little bit of a freelance basis, and the newsroom environment had changed so much. It was so odd to me to be sitting in a room next to, younger colleagues who would, message me on the computer. And it was just like, you're sitting in front of me, right? Like, just, turn around and have a conversation. And I think, that's strange to me, that camaraderie, I don't know if it's existing in any newsrooms anymore. I mean, I feel very lucky to have been working in Philly, especially at a time when there was such a great, close press corps, like friendly competition, and
sure.
And a lot of great people. So sometimes I miss it. I don't ever sit at home and wish I was out in the storm. I was standing out there with the microphone. And I am with the book. I do really like that I had this opportunity to dig deeper into a story and tell something a little more in depth.
Yeah. So what's next for you? You split your time between New York and Ocean City. Any other books in the making, perhaps?
Well, this one took 17 years. So
Wow.
it actually was a labor of love. I mean, it's, 17 years ago that I moved down and first started writing the story. So I'm not sure I have another 17-year book in me, but I will say there's a lot of good stories that got left out of this one. So maybe that'll be the next one. I don't know. I'm enjoying, I'm so pleased with the reception I've had for this so far. I'm kind of enjoying promoting that a little bit, and we'll see if people like it and they read it and they want more, then maybe another book, but I think definitely a screenplay, right? Yeah. So for everyone, it's got to be a movie. So that's anybody out there who wants to work on a movie, let me know.
And so that's the next question, is then if it becomes a screenplay and it gets green lighted, who would you like to see play Margie Smith Holt?
Well, Reese Witherspoon is always the number one choice. So, because she's so great and, has done so much for promoting women's stories in her own production company. But there are a lot of other women who are doing that now. So I'll have to do some more investigating. But Reese is at the top. I mean, I wouldn't say no to Reese.
Well, I want to thank you so much for, first of all, agreeing to do this interview, and secondly, for your book. And again, it is the book is available online. It's again, go to margiesmithholt.com. You can find more information as well as how to get your copy of the book. And I want to continue the dialogue with you, but that clock, as you know, on the wall dictates all, and we got to wrap this up. But wish you continued success, and wish you all the very best in the future, and hopefully we'll reconnect again in person at some point.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Paul.
All right, Margie, thank you so much for being with us here on the program. Until the next time, my name is Paul Perrello. Thanks so much for being with us on the Philly Factor.